I did some things differently from most other cruisers I met during my circumnavigation from 2022 to 2025 on board Sea Change, my 1989 Pacific Seacraft 34. Here are the second 13 of 26. Number 14. I sailed an older, slower boat. 50 years ago, when the Pacific Seacraft 34 was designed by Bill Crelock, it would have been considered mid-sized for an ocean cruiser, being designed as the little brother of the original Pacific Seacraft 37 shown here. Both models were initially called Crelocks, and the mainsail on Sea Change had that insignia on it. And Pacific Seacraft makes even smaller models like the 31, with a square stern to provide more interior volume versus the canoe stern of the 37 and 34, as well as larger models, 40 and 44 and even larger. Today, a 34-footer is definitely on the small size amongst cruisers, with 40 feet and upwards the norm, not to mention the proliferation of catamarans. Sea Change was usually the smallest boat in anchorages, with only a few 32 and even occasional 30-footers around. Sea Change was also 30 years old when I bought her and 36 when I finished, with the vast majority of boats out there being much newer. Her waterline length of 27 feet limited hull speed to around 7 knots, and her age, particularly her original sails from Ullman sails, limited performance as well. Nevertheless, since most of my subtropical circumnavigation was sailing downwind in the southeast trades and near the end in northeast trades, neither of these was a major issue for me. For example, my initial Pacific Ocean passage of 4,000 miles from Panama to the Marquesas took 35 days for an average speed of 5 knots, which I consider respectable. Number 15. I touched terra firma 5 times. Cruisers obviously avoid groundings, as they are often embarrassing and or costly, and my last one was both, but the first 4 were less serious. The first was a mud in Faroe Bay on Raiatea in the Society Islands of French Polynesia, where I anchored at the head of the bay just before a known area of shallow mud, visible in satellite views like this, with the red X indicating our approximate position. A southwest breeze was blowing us away from it, but in the night the wind swung 180 degrees to the northeast, and in the morning Sea Change was surprisingly still. It took a while for me to figure out that we were stuck in mud, confirmed by the depth sounder showing 3 feet to our 5-foot draft. Fortunately, a combination of the engine running in forward and the windlass kedged us out of it. The second was a sand the very next day in a little cove at the nearby entrance pass to Raiatea. This was a delightful but deep anchorage where several boats were stern-tied to palm trees on shore to oppose their anchor in the deep center of the cove. Stern tying is not easy for a solo sailor, so I chose instead to run Sea Change gently up onto the surrounding sandbank, set the anchor, and then backed off into deep water, using the stern anchor to keep us there. The third was also a sand, near the pass on my PT in the Leeward Islands of French Polynesia, where I was distracted while seeking a temporary day anchorage and ran up on shallow sand, again easily backed off. My fourth was a coral off the eastern flanking island of Onokuhihifu in the Hapai group of Tonga. I had skirted the charted coral to get there from Tofanga Island to the northeast, but the next morning chose to sail off the anchor and headed back, straight into the coral, indicated by the red X here. The tracks here are not detailed, as they are from PredictWind, which only updated once an hour. Again, I was able to back off with the engine, leaving only some scrapes on the keel and a little damaged coral. But my fifth and last encounter with terra firma was both embarrassing and eventually costly, as described in detail in my video on 30 mistakes and breakages, part 2 of 3. I got distracted by what I thought were possible mooring buoys in the entrance to Pancake Creek on the Queensland coast of Australia. I left the channel indicated on my chart and marked by navigation buoys, only to discover the hard way that these apparent mooring buoys actually marked reefs and rocks. We went truly hard aground on the rocky bottom, marked by the red X here on my iSailor chart, and only got off because the tide was flooding. This cost me dearly when it came time to sell Sea Change, because the buyer used the extended smile at the hull to keel joint to beat the price down significantly. Number 16. I had backup rigging for most of my circumnavigation. Initially, my backup rigging was spare halyards and sheets, plus lifelines and mooring lines I had on board when I discovered broken strands in the wires of the standing rigging while in Beveridge Reef. And later, I used ratcheting tie-down straps and chains. Eventually, I replaced all of that with Dyneema, and even when I had replaced the wires in Fiji in Season 2, I kept the Dyneema backup in place, shown here just inside of the outer shrouds. I chose not to replace all the other components of the standing rigging, including the chain plates, pins, tangs, turnbuckles, and bolts, on the grounds that they appeared to be in good shape. Nevertheless, at the masthead, I made the Dyneema attachment points independent of the existing standing rigging, using large strops over the masthead. At the bottoms, though, I had to use the chain plates. Given how many boats either lost or came close to losing their masts, I felt good about this, but I did not see another boat that did this. I also backed up the topping lift, given that I used it and a tightened preventer and main sheet to hold the boom in place when sailing downwind. Number 17. I used an Iridium Go satellite phone for communications at sea. When I started out, this was the best option available, albeit at a considerable cost of $1,000 for the unit, plus $500 for the external aerial, which improves its signal strength. The subscription fee for the unlimited plan was substantial, but I used the texting ability at sea to communicate with Christina and others, plus to post my blog each evening, and it is required to download weather files. Each month I saved most of my phone call time till near the end of the month in case of an emergency, and then called friends and family to use up the allotted 150 minutes. I only occasionally used the email facility, which was low capacity and restricted to text, so was no good for the kinds of forms required by check-in authorities. On top of that, I had a PredictWind standard subscription, which was well worth it and well utilized for weather predictions and for my tracker with blog, although I never used their departure and routing options, perhaps to my disadvantage sometimes. I also enjoyed being able to follow the tracks and sometimes read the blogs of other cruisers. The downsides to the Iridium Go are obviously its very slow speed, no more than old-time dial-up speed, and hence no internet connection, but for my purposes this was fine. Another downside was that it would regularly simply quit working, which was cause for concern initially, but resolved by briefly removing the battery each time. The vast majority of cruisers today have Starlink, and therefore have effective internet access at sea, overcoming all the limitations of the Iridium Go. Some retain their Iridium Go units or buy a used one cheaply as backup to Starlink. I probably should have had a backup to the Iridium, like a Garmin InReach. Of course, once near or on land, I used my iPhone, either with a local SIM card or just paid AT&T a lot more money. And it is remarkable how far out to sea cell service works, commonly over 10 miles, as there are no obstacles. So for coastal passages like Queensland and South Africa, I had cell service and internet access most of the way, and similarly for the Caribbean. Number 18. I used mostly iSailor charts. The vast majority of cruisers use Navionics software for their charts on phones and tablets, or OpenCPN on laptops, or custom software on chart plotters like Garmin. And I did purchase a ridiculously expensive Garmin SD card with the charts for French Polynesia as backup on my installed chart plotter, but never used it. Instead, I only used that chart plotter for its depth sounder. There are also lots of competitors such as INAX and Orca. However, I chose to primarily use a simple and less detailed charting software called iSailor, which only works on Apple iPhones and iPads. I was introduced to it by Webb Charles, who used it on his sixth and final circumnavigation on Gannet. Like Navionics, it is now a subscription service, so one has to pay for the charts for each region each year. However, the price is much lower than Navionics. Like Navionics, you can install the charts on as many phones or tablets as you like, which is excellent for redundancy. The charts are less detailed than Navionics, but I actually preferred that approach, as it forced me to pay attention to what I was doing when near land. They also have the advantage of not allowing obstacles to disappear when not zoomed in enough, which is critical for avoiding small reefs and rocks. Navionics has the upper hand in several other areas, however. Most importantly, in providing satellite view overlays and showing tidal flows through passes and channels. I purchased the Navionics charts for the area around Darwin in Australia for the latter, as the approach to Darwin from the north is through a channel with significant tidal flows, here shown helping and later opposing us. Another major advantage of Navionics is the social aspect, including details on anchorages that others have contributed, for which I instead used the Navily app and contributed several anchorages there, and occasionally the No Foreign Land app. Number 19. I did not keep a log. Keeping a log is an age-old tradition for cruisers and other sailors, generally recording the obvious things like position at noon each day, weather conditions, distance sailed each 24 hours, and any pertinent observations. I believe this tradition is dying out, and it certainly did for me, despite my best intentions and a proper logbook like this on board. Instead, I made text blog posts on my PredictWind tracker every evening, effectively recording most of the same information and providing a summary track of my circumnavigation. The missing data I would have liked to have was distance sailed each day and hence cumulative distance. These could have been obtained from my charting software. However, I ran that on 2 different iPads and 3 different iPhones over the course of the 4 seasons, so I do not have an accurate account of either, but assume I sailed over 25,000 miles. Number 20. I did not use the head. The head was non-functional when I bought Sea Change, and I paid a local cruiser at Panama to fix it with a service kit while I was away. It worked for visits by Christina and Erica on our shakedown cruise to the San Blas, and when they later visited in Fakarava in French Polynesia, plus during our Panama Canal transit. But when sailing alone, I did not use it. I peed overboard holding onto a shroud initially, but eventually felt that was too risky, so used a pee bottle. For major sewage disposal, I used a 5-gallon rigid bucket with a toilet seat, primed and rinsed with seawater collected with this little canvas bucket. I preferred the view in the cockpit. I would usually become queasy when moving forward in the cabin underway, so would have found using the head there problematic, which also meant I never had to deal with issues like clogged piping or needing to use the holding tank. I did not have a single accident with this bucket and chucket system, albeit in rough conditions I had to be careful. Of course, when in marinas, I used the facilities on shore. The downside was that when I came to sell Sea Change, the head was not working, so I spent a day servicing it again. Number 21. I mostly did not use the check stays. At least I believe that is what they are called, versus running backstays that go to the stern of the boat. These check stays attached to pad eyes on the side decks just as I exited the cockpit, which made them an obstruction to moving forward on the windward side. There also appeared to be no need for them, as the mast made by Lefale in California was particularly sturdy, and even in the most robust upwind beating, I noticed no pumping of the mast, which is what check stays are designed to prevent. When I discovered broken strands in the standing rigging wires, I did use the check stays for a while as an additional insurance against losing the mast, along with all of my various backup rigging. I kept them secured to a stanchion alongside the lifelines instead. Number 22. I did not use the asymmetrical spinnaker that came with Sea Change. It had a sock to control it, so I should have, and had lots of light wind sailing opportunities to do so, but I was too chicken, having heard accounts of disasters with them and seen enough videos of spinnakers wrapped around rigging. When Christina and Erica were with me on our second shakedown cruise from Panama to the San Blas Islands in 2021, we flew it successfully on both legs, hence this picture, but I never had the nerve to try it solo. As a result, I motor sailed more than I should have in light conditions, and if I sailed oceans again, I would force myself to practice using the asymmetrical spinnaker more. Number 23. I did not use the paper charts on board or a sextant I bought. The paper charts were a large collection from the previous owners, plus a large set rescued from an abandoned steel boat that burnt at Panama while being cut up for disposal. I won the plastic sextant like this at a silent auction at our sailing club's annual dinner, but it never left its case and eventually had to be discarded as it was completely moldy. I could not really have used the latter anyway, as I did not have the required tables or experience with it, and today that is not uncommon. I had imagined plotting my position on paper charts, as many cruisers do, in part for the physical memoir, and in part in case bizarrely the GPS system went down, I would know at least my last position. Number 24. I carried many other heavy or cumbersome things around the world, mostly or entirely unused. Some of these were safety items most cruisers carry, and I fortunately never had to employ, like the long out-of-service Revere Offshore Commander life raft, several harnesses and inflatable and regular life jackets, as well as a life ring, plus 2 EPIRBs and a PLB. I also had 5 unused fire extinguishers on board. Others were redundant equipment I never used on the circumnavigation, particularly 2 roll-up dinghies that went around the world on the foredeck under my hard-bottom dinghy. Sea Change came with 4 anchors, of which I only really used and needed the Manson Supreme on the bow. I never used the backup Bruce anchor and chain on the bow, which I eventually moved to the Port Lazaret to remove more weight from the bow, where it joined a large secure anchor like this, and I only used the Danforth stern anchor and chain twice. Australian Ian Watson kindly gave me a heavy-duty, homemade stainless steel coral or rock anchor, but I only used it once. Sea Change came with a Jordan Series drogue, which I set up ready to deploy for the passages to and from New Zealand, as well as the Indian and Atlantic Ocean passages, but later gave it to Mara, the Norwegian entrant in the 2026 Golden Globe race. I also built a large warp setup from scavenged ropes on beaches and my mooring lines, but never had the occasion to deploy it. When I bought the used large 330-watt solar panel, a heavy 2,000-watt inverter came with it, but I only needed the old 1,000-watt inverter on board to charge my Mac and power tool batteries. In Fiji, I purchased a used furler identical to the one on board and carried it around, stashed in the V-berth with lots of other stuff. The previous owners had installed a pressure water system, but the pump leaked, and I had no need for it. I bought a used Weldon boom brake that I used initially but took it off when I got my preventer system set up. I had an old scuba setup like this for emergencies that I tested twice along the way and also upgraded in Tonga but never used. Sea Change came fully equipped with cooking paraphernalia including 2 pressure cookers like this, but I only used a small frying pan and a pot. A regular sewing machine like this lived under the porthburt and was a rusted wreck when I eventually tossed it. I never had use for the installed propane heater in the cabin, on the right here, plus had 2 redundant rusty propane tanks like this I did not use in the aft gas locker. There was also a library of sailing and equipment manuals and guides on board, few of which I used. I had 2 fishing rods, but soon gave up using them in favor of hand reels, and never used a large throw net, bottom center here. Erica used the hammock on board once. I carried a spare mainsail around the world as backup for the tired original Ullman sails, and did eventually use it for the sea trial requested by my buyer, but failed to get a picture of it. Rather unusually, after having my transmission repaired in New Zealand, I carried a spare reconditioned transmission like this, and it did prove useful, as after redamaging the original one, I swapped it in Cape Town. Sea Change was already a heavy boat, so carrying all this redundant equipment did not make much difference to her performance, but I did raise the waterline by a few inches before leaving Panama. Number 25. Other things I did without. I did not have several things most cruisers today consider to be basic equipment. This included things like wind instruments on the masthead, although I did have a Windex for wind direction. I did not have an NMEA 2000 electronic network on board, so my Raymarine EV100 tiller autopilot could not have connected to wind instruments for steering a course to the wind anyway. And that, of course, is what the Pacific Wind Pilot Windvane did for me instead. The analog amp and voltmeters on the electrical panel did not work, so instead I used a car cigarette lighter socket plug with a built-in digital voltmeter to power the small angle fridge and my iPhones and iPads. It was not marine grade, so had to be replaced each season, but they are cheap and allowed me to keep track of the battery charge. If I did it again, a simple battery management monitor would be useful. I did not have a separate freezer, so while the angle can be set low enough to be a freezer, that would preclude using it to store bread, milk, fruits, meats, cheese, etc. I therefore had to eat fish I caught within a few days, so I attempted to catch smaller fish. I did not have gauges on the diesel or the water tanks, so I estimated diesel usage by the engine hours and never let the tank run dry, and simply refilled the water tank when it was empty. Finally, I did not have radar, but my circumnavigation did not involve areas with fog. Number 26. I never talked to my phone camera. I belatedly include here a chronological series of selfies. I obviously took photos and video clips throughout my sailing. When I had cell service or Wi-Fi access, I included pictures in my blog on my PredictWind tracker that I shared with family and friends, supplementing my daily text blog posts. However, video clips could not be included there. Once I started this YouTube channel in late 2022 to share the clips, supplemented with photos where relevant, with family and friends, they also became available to anyone else who cared to watch. I only posted these videos at the end of each season, and now these summary videos many months after I returned home. I was not trying to be a YouTuber, so did not address the camera at any point, instead showing what I was seeing and experiencing.